Namaste, my friends, and welcome back to the Law of One series. So this is going to be sort of a unique episode in that I'm going to be sharing with you a personal view of mine that I've come to understand over the years of my Law of One studies and through my own journey of self-realization. I'm also going to be sort of combining two different series into one, as we're going to be talking about a new way to see enlightenment and the higher self. So if you've been watching my spiritual intelligence series, I'm going to be pulling a lot from the concepts talked about in that series and using them to sort of complement what the Law of One has to say about the higher self. So while this perspective of the higher self will likely be a unique one to you, I think you'll see that it provides an awe-inspiring view of the true meaning of enlightenment. So I'd like to invite you to join me for this 21st episode of the Law of One series, as we look at enlightenment as an incarnative process of manifesting the higher self. So what I want to present you with today is sort of a new model or perspective for understanding enlightenment as the process of higher self manifestation, or perhaps higher self incarnation. As the Law of One teaches, our higher self is the late sixth density version of us who has completed all of its incarnations into space-time, and now from the time-space dimension, or the astral plane, sort of turns back in time to watch and guide all of its previous incarnations or lifetimes. So you could say that the higher self re-experiences all of the dreams it ever had into physical manifestation, but this time not as the dream character, but as the dream architect. The higher self's duty while you are in third density is to serve you experiences and catalysts that help you evolve and polarize over each lifetime, but without violating your free will. So it can leave clues along your path, it can point you in the right direction and help guide you gently, but it cannot make decisions for you. In the same way that you can't make decisions for your dream character while you're just watching the dream. Unless, of course, the dream character becomes lucid and awakens within the dream. So we could say that the sort of ultimate victory for the higher self is to program your incarnate experiences in such a way that you reach enlightenment in a third density lifetime, so that the higher self gets to essentially incarnate into the physical body and live out this life experience the way that you get to live out a dream when you become lucid in the dream. So this is what we call self-realization, and it happens in varying degrees, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So I know that this idea sort of boggles the mind a little bit, that you are just experiencing a dream of the higher self. But the more we investigate this idea, the more it continually adds up to what we know to be true metaphysically of who we really are. That all we ultimately are is the finished, completed version that has already crossed the finish line, so to speak, and become perfected. You are that perfected self, even now in this lifetime. This is what we call the higher self. So to make this easier to understand, we can take the analogy of dreams and see that it isn't actually far-fetched at all, because this is already what you're doing as well in this very incarnation. When you dream at night, you, the physical self, falls asleep and projects a dream version of itself that goes on all kinds of adventures. But does this dream character really exist? Because during the dream, you fully and completely feel that you, the dream character, is real. But upon waking, you say, "Oh, thank goodness, it was only a dream. None of it was real." In the same way, this person you are appearing as in this life is just as unreal to the higher self. It is merely one dream life that it's had out of countless thousands. So in this way, we can say that when you are dreaming at night, the physical body that is lying in bed dreaming you is your higher self, just as your higher self of 6th density is the physical person's higher self. What this means is that lucid dreaming would be the equivalent of enlightenment in the dream world. Everything in the universe is fractal. It is the same experience happening at different levels or dimensions of reality. So when one remembers in the dream, I am not this dream body. This is not my real self. I am higher than this. They become lucid and free of the dream consequences and can demonstrate supernatural powers in the dream, like levitation, telepathy, and thought creation. And these are all the same powers that realized beings and sages gain after self-realization. So the realized one ultimately has the same exact recognition that a dream character has in a lucid dream. This body is not my real self. I am higher than this. In session 70, Ra explains this fact briefly when asked whether or not all of our lives are occurring separately or simultaneously. Questioner: the way I see it right now is that I am existing in 2 different locations, here and in mid-6th density simultaneously. Is this correct? I am Ra. You are existing at all levels simultaneously. It is specifically correct that your higher self is you in mid-6th density, and in your way of measuring what you know of as time, your higher self is yourself in your future. So isn't it true then that in the same way that you are sort of reviewing all of your dream lifetimes every single night, the higher self is doing the same thing with you right now from its dimension of the 6th density? So the question is, which one's the real you, right? Would you say that your dream characters at night are the real you? You would say, oh no, they're just one little blip, one fragment of my mind that I just project for a short period of time. It's not the totality of what I am. Isn't that how the higher self would then see this physical incarnation? Ultimately, since all physical lifetimes are just the sum total of the final completed version of yourself, the higher self, that would mean that that's ultimately what you are. That this personality you experience is just a slice of the pie, so to speak. So from that perspective, getting attached and identified with it is a very futile endeavor. Much better to simply appreciate it as the reflection that it is, but not see it as the sum total of who you really are. So as Ra says in session 70, the higher self is the end result of all the development experienced by the mind-body-spirit complex up to that point. So when one transcends ego, they are transcending the gravity of the dream self that keeps them asleep to their cosmic reality. So the question is, what takes the ego's place once it is transcended? What is left there without the ego? Of course, your real self, or your higher self. In my Spiritual Intelligence series, I talk about the 7 levels of spiritual intelligence as a different way of seeing our energy centers. So we could say that from the perspective of the dream character, we experience our energy centers as 7 levels of spiritual intelligence that we unlock through spiritual disciplines and effort. But from the higher self's perspective, we could see them as 7 degrees of lucidity. Because again, the higher self is dreaming this incarnation. So the higher up the energy centers we move, the more lucid we become to allow the higher self to manifest through this dream character. So let's take a look at the SQ chart for a minute so we can elucidate this a little bit further. At the heart chakra level of SQ, we begin awakening to the reality of the higher self as we start to feel that maybe we're not a body after all, but something that is far beyond it. And when we reach the illumination SQ level, we are becoming illuminated from within by the light of the higher self. Although each of the 7 levels are technically different degrees of higher self incarnation, the illumination level is really where true higher self incarnation begins, because it is the first of the 7 levels where the ego is transcended. The Buddha said that enlightenment is the end of suffering. So as long as you're still suffering in this dream, can we really say that you're fully lucid yet to who you are? Once you know for a fact that you're just dreaming, it's impossible to suffer any longer. And since suffering ends at the illumination SQ level, this is where the higher self really begins to come through the personality. In my Spiritual Intelligence series, I also talk about how the illumination level of SQ is where the 3 states of mastery begin. And each one of these 3 states of mastery correlates to one of the upper 3 energy centers. And these are called the I am state, the flow state, and the channeling state. So you may be thinking, aren't these the same thing then? Like, what's the difference between the upper 3 SQ levels and the 3 states of mastery? And the answer is ultimately yes, they are the same thing. But the distinction is that a level is what consciousness is, and a state is what consciousness does. A level of consciousness represents how much energy is being produced at that level. A state of consciousness represents how consciousness uses all of that energy. So these 3 states of mastery could also be described as the 3 states of higher self incarnation. If enlightenment is really just the process of the higher self manifesting within us, then they could also be seen as the 3 stages of enlightenment. The first aspect of the higher self that permeates through the person at the illumination level is the I am principle. This is the state where we begin to feel the presence of the higher self within us in the form of peace, inner stillness, and love for all things. This state represents the mind being purified by the higher self, and we could say that this is the first stage of enlightenment. The next state of higher self incarnation is called the flow state. This is where the higher self is now living through the physical body. There's no inner sense of doing anything, but that some higher power and intelligence seems to be controlling the body now. People who experience sudden satori will classically say things like, "I do not know how I am doing anything. Some great power has overtaken me." In Advaita, this is called non-doership. One is moved by powerful intuitions they have no control over, as if they are just watching the body now like a dream character. This represents the second stage of enlightenment. And finally, we reach the 3rd state of mastery at the singularity level, called the channeling state. And this is where one is now fully channeling the higher self. One has essentially become the higher self, even to the point of speaking as it. This is the 3rd and final stage of enlightenment, or higher self incarnation. Because the higher self exists outside of space and time, it only knows itself as the absolute. And this is why beings such as Christ, Krishna, the Buddha, and many others often speak like they are gods. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the beginning, middle, and end of creation. If you could see the miracle in a single flower, everything would change, for I am the miracle. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more context for what I mean when I say that enlightenment, or self-realization, is really the spiritual emergence of the higher self through the mind-body-spirit complex. And this is why it's only possible through the process of polarization, or raising our energy level. Because as we talked about in a previous episode, the higher self calibrates its level of consciousness between 50 and 60,000. And the highest possible level of consciousness for a 3rd density body is 1,000. So there is a limitation, in a sense, of how much of the higher self can truly be brought through in a third density body. But we can loosely say from that perspective that enlightenment is the gradual process of higher self incarnation into third density. So if the higher self calibrates beginning at 50,000, we could say that the maximum amount we can truly bring the higher self through in a third density body is about 2%. But as we move into the fourth density, which calibrates up to 5,000, we can bring through about 10% of the higher self. Moving to the fifth density, which calibrates up to 20,000, we can bring through about 40% of the higher self. And so as we move through the densities, more and more of the higher self comes through the incarnation, until finally we live our final sixth density incarnation and then move into the position of the higher self. So we are always literally on the journey of becoming the higher self, as the Law of One teaches. And words like enlightenment, realization, illumination are just the terminologies that we give to this process that's really far beyond human understanding. Now, interestingly, the Law of One also teaches that the higher self of late sixth density also has a kind of higher self, which is called the mind-body-spirit complex totality. And this is the mid-seventh density version of you, which has completed billions of more years of polarization outside of space and time. So it also serves as a kind of reference or guide or resource to the higher self, which is going through this extremely challenging task of guiding and manifesting all of its previous incarnations without infringing on the law of confusion or free will. And Ra has a really fascinating quote where they describe how all of these aspects of you are truly one and the same, that you are just an incarnation of your higher self, just like the higher self is an incarnation of the MBS totality, which is also an incarnation of the one infinite creator. I am Ra. To simplify this concept is our intent. The higher self is a manifestation given to the late sixth density mind-body-spirit complex as a gift from its future selfness. The mid-seventh density's last action before turning towards the allness of the creator and gaining spiritual mass is to give this resource to the sixth density self, moving as you measure time in the stream of time. This self, the mind-body-spirit complex of late sixth density, has then the honor duty of using both the experiences of its total living bank or memory of experienced thoughts and actions, and using the resource of the mind-body-spirit complex totality left behind as a type of infinitely complex thought form. In this way, you may see yourself, your higher self or oversoul, and your mind-body-spirit complex totality as 3 points in a circle. The only distinction is that of your time-space continuum. All are the same being. So the main difference between the higher self and the MBS totality Ra talks about is that the totality is not actually a living being in space-time anymore, but it's sort of a holographic replica, thought form version of the seventh density self that it leaves to the higher self as a resource before it turns and merges into the allness of the creator. And so this thought form structure of the mind-body-spirit complex totality can be used by the higher self to study and gain reference from to guide its previous incarnations. So what Ra is saying here is that we only see ourselves as different from the higher self because of the illusion of time. In actuality, you are the higher self here and now. The only thing stopping you from realizing this is the ego complex of third density, the dream character that you think you are. So the transcendence of ego is simultaneously then the manifestation of the higher self, the universal ego. In the Vedantic tradition, Brahman is the name given to the universal ego or self. and the constant meditation upon Brahman and identification with it makes the ego melt away gradually in the light of our universal nature. In order to allow the realization of the higher self to come through, the Brahmins of India for thousands of years have used the sacred chanting or repetition of the mantra Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, universal ego. So since it is the higher self's entire job to help you polarize in third density, we could say that this self-realization of Brahman represents the highest degree of possible success for programming catalyst that the higher self can achieve. So the beautiful thing is that when you reach enlightenment, you also help your higher self to polarize in the same way that it helps you polarize. It's a win-win situation for both versions of yourself, because on the positive path, giving and receiving are one. So this clearly touches on the third discipline of the personality, become the creator, meaning stop knowing yourself merely as a third density body and understand that you are the higher self, emerging and manifesting through this third density body. How much of the higher self is allowed to express in this lifetime, though, is entirely up to you. So I'll leave you now, as always, with one final quote from Ra, who describes in session 36 in greater detail about the mind-body-spirit complex totality. In previous communications, you have spoken of the mind-body-spirit complex totality. Would you please give us a definition of the mind-body-spirit complex totality? I am Ra. There is a dimension in which time does not have sway. In this dimension, the mind-body-spirit, in its eternal dance of the present, may be seen in totality, and before the mind-body-spirit complex is willingly absorbed into the allness of the one infinite creator, the entity knows itself in its totality. This mind-body-spirit complex totality functions as, shall we say, a resource for what you would perhaps call the higher self. The higher self, in turn, is a resource for examining the distillations of third density experience and programming further experience. This is also true of densities 4, 5, and 6, with the mind-body-spirit complex totality coming into consciousness in the course of 7th density.